Evening, everybody. So I have my first opportunity to be able to come and present a class with you guys, and I got to say, for a while I was pretty nervous just knowing that you guys can actually talk back to me. But hopefully I actually have some people talking back to me. So that's the other aspect in all of this. And in going into this, we're going about the prophet Habakkuk. And when I was looking into this, because before I started doing any stuff in reference for this class, I hadn't actually spent much time looking into Habakkuk and didn't really know anything about him at all. And I started to find out that it was an interesting story. So I wanted to see if anybody could answer me this question. What do we know about Habakkuk? The person, yes. Yeah, exactly. We don't know much about him. Yeah, he was a prophet. Perfect, yes. And that's really about as much as we get about him. And when it comes to Habakkuk, there's a couple of people, when it comes to minor prophets, there's a couple of them that actually have some stuff explained about who they are. If we look in Zephaniah, as well as, was it Amos? Yeah, okay, so we look into Zephaniah and Amos. We can actually see that they talk about the lineage, or they'll talk about the profession, or we can even see the kings that are listed during the time that these prophets were active. In Zephaniah chapter 1, the word of the Lord which came to Zephaniah, son of Cushi, and I'm not sure if I pronounce these names correctly, so bear with me, I'm just going to commit to them. Son of Gilead, son of Jeremiah, and son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, son of Amon, king of Judah. And so, again, we have this lineage that's being brought about, and then we're also being told about the king that is in Judah at the time. So we actually have this timeline that starts to get set up here from the first verse in this chapter, in Zephaniah. And if we go into Amos, we can actually see what it is that Amos had done, and he's a sheep herder. And so it talks about what it is that he does and the things that are going on in his time as well. It says in Amos chapter 1, verse 1, the word of Amos, who was among the sheep herders from Tekoa, which he envisioned in visions concerning Israel in the days of Uzzah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. And so as it comes in, there's some times where we get this information that's being brought to us. But Habakkuk, that is not the case. We don't have anything telling us much about him. Unfortunately, in the first verse, really, the only thing that we get, and as like Carol said, is that the oracle Habakkuk, the prophet, the oracle which Habakkuk the prophet saw. And so in this, we hear that he's a prophet. And in this, it also talks about the oracle. And the oracle is a word that gets used a couple of times explaining what it is that these prophets see and are dealing with. And from what I was able to understand, the word oracle is meaning burden here. So it doesn't give us an insight into who Habakkuk is, that word oracle. But it does give us some information about the book and the contents of the book. Because using that word oracle or burden would mean a heavy load to be borne or to be lifted up. And here in the writings of other prophets, it means to lift up the writings of other prophets. It means to lift up the voice in proclamation, an utterance or prophecy, denouncing the sins of a people by pronouncing on them or their place of habitation a heavy judgment. And so it gets us into the idea of what it is that we're going to see coming from Habakkuk. This idea of this heavy judgment that's going to go upon the people or their habitation. And so that is the exact case that we see here. That we'll be looking into this judgment that's coming into them. And does anybody know from where this judgment's coming from? Because in the book of Habakkuk, they talk about the Chaldeans who are going to be coming in order to judge them. And so this comes from the Chaldeans, which gives us actually information. Now we finally have something that we can start to get a hold of to understand what was taking place in the background of this book. because we know that the Chaldeans are the ones who are going to be bringing this judgment onto the people of Judah. And so knowing this, it gives us a little bit of that timeline that can place us around 612 BC to about 606 BC. So those are the timelines that Habakkuk was most likely to be active in the book here. So when the Chaldeans had already started their march towards that conquest, that's one of the dates in which we're looking towards, but the fact that they had yet to reach Judah and Jerusalem. So those are the concepts we're keeping in mind. So we want to look into some important dates when it comes to, and well, that came out a little bit smaller than I thought, so try and just bear with me on some of that. But we're going to look into some dates when it comes to what it is that we're dealing with here in the timeline. Again, we're dealing with the Chaldeans. And the Chaldeans start to rise to power within Babylon under the king Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. He declares the independence of Chaldea from the Assyrians, establishing an independent kingdom in Babylon. So we have this king who then kind of separates the Chaldeans from Assyria, making Chaldea show up. And so they are still a part of Babylon. Babylon is within Chaldea, but now they are the Chaldeans who have now declared themselves in that independence away from the Assyrians, establishing an independence that they hadn't had. So then in 614, Nebuchadnezzar, which is a name that we should be fairly familiar with, I'd imagine. Nebuchadnezzar's the character here who leads an army in an attack against Nineveh as he's pushing off the Assyrians. And so we have this taking place in the year 614 BC. So they're actually starting to become successful, making their way out. And then in the year 612, they actually start to take over the Assyrians. They actually start to win in this fight. And so now we have the Assyrians starting to back off because they're being defeated and overtaken by the Chaldeans. So in 609 BC, Nebuchadnezzar then follows the fleeing Assyrians and is chasing them down to destroy the remaining Assyrian power that was oppressing them. So he's out to get them, and at that same time, here comes Egypt, again, still in 609 BC. Egypt, they try and stop the Chaldeans and are trying to help the Assyrians. And in doing that, Josiah, the king of Judah at the time, the last good king of Judah, as it said, King Josiah attempts to stop the Egyptians from helping the Assyrians. And as he does this is when he ends up meeting with the Egyptians and dies in this process. And so they end up killing off Josiah here. And then it's at 605 that the Chaldeans end up reaching Jerusalem after being successful defeating the Assyrians. And then they put their oppression onto Judah and carry some of the people of Jerusalem off to Babylon. And among whom, I think is an interesting aspect, is Daniel. This is actually when Daniel gets taken away. And so this is the timeline that we have set up. This is the information that we know that we can say, okay, so as we look into this, and we can see what's said in Habakkuk, and we'll look at verses 1:6 and 3:16, which help us to then look at these dates and get some information as to when he's talking. Because in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 6 says, "For behold, I am rising up the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous people who march throughout the earth and seize dwelling places which are not theirs." And so in Habakkuk 1:6 tells us, okay, these people have started to show up. Behold, I'm rising them up. So we can assume that at this point they've started to take on the Assyrians, which would put them, and defeating the Assyrians, which would put them at about 612 BC. But then now moving into Habakkuk 3:16, "I heard, and my inward parts trembled. At the sound, my lips quivered. Decay enters my bones, and in my place I tremble, because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us." So they haven't made it there yet. So they haven't gotten there yet, but they are starting their conquest. Okay, so that gives us that background into what is taking place in reference with Chaldea and when we can date this. And so we feel very comfortable making that statement, or I feel very comfortable making that statement, 612 to 606 BC is when this is all taking place. And we have that timeline now established, we can start to look into that concept of a king. Because again, we can see with some of the other prophets, the kings that were there, we now have that ability to start to place a king. Because Josiah now would have fallen in Egypt, leaving in place a new king. And we can actually see what happens preceding Josiah in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 30 and 32. And we can actually see what ends up taking place to put the next person in power, and at the end of that, see the character of the person who is now in power. It says, his servants drove his body in a chariot, and his servants, being Pharaoh Necho here, drove his body, which is Josiah, in a chariot from Megiddo, and brought him to Jerusalem, and buried him in his own tomb. Then the people of the land took Jehoaz, the son of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king in place of his father. Joaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 3 months in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Hamutal, and daughters of Jeremiah of Libnah. He did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all his fathers had done. So here we have somebody who gets put into power now for about 3 months and starts to enact evil. He's already starting to go against. And again, we had Josiah just a moment ago, who was the person that was king previously, but then was doing and was trying to actually reform Israel. Was trying to reform Judah and make them follow God and listen to him. And then this ends up taking place, and then in 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 34 to 37, and 37, we can see that Pharaoh Necho, who was then comes in and made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king of the place of Josiah his father, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. But he took Jehoaz away and brought him into Egypt, and he died there. And then in verse 37, it tells us about his character as well. He did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his fathers had done. I know this is a lot of background that we've gone into here, but this gives us that idea of what it is that is taking place here. We can see that Habakkuk would have been under that time with Josiah, but now everything is starting to fall apart. He's starting to see the corruption of Israel of Judah taking place. And so this would have been something that gives us that idea of what it is that is so upsetting when we see Habakkuk start out the book and starts to address what's going on. And when this book's addressed, something that I find very interesting about the book of Habakkuk is it shows us a conversation that's taking place, and it's not that conversation between Habakkuk and the people. But can someone tell me what's special about this book? What conversation? Who is Habakkuk talking to? God. Yeah, God, it's just that's the interaction taking place here. That it's him and God in a back and forth conversation. And so I always liked that concept that we see this kind of going on, this direct information and back and forth. And at the beginning of this verse, Habakkuk is speaking on behalf of somebody. So who is it in the first few verses that he's speaking on behalf of? Because when you see this in chapter 2 to verse 4, he says that he's upset about the violence that's going on. But who is it that he's worried about here? Exactly, the righteous of Judah. The righteous of Judah is starting to see the deterioration of the leadership in Judah, and he starts to speak out against the people who are ruling over Judah at the time. And he's starting to get upset. So in verse 2, we're in chapter 1, verse 2 through 4, it says, "How long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity, and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists, and contention arises. Therefore the law is ignored, and justice is never upheld. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore, justice comes out perverted. And so at the beginning of this book, Habakkuk is lamenting over the state of Israel, or Judah. I'm going to probably do that over and over again as I'm looking into my notes and going back and forth. So bear with me if I keep correcting myself. But as it is, he sees all of this that's going on, and he's asking God, how long will I call out to you? And this implies that fact that he's been calling out for a while. He's been calling for help. And he doesn't see God doing anything. He says, I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. And so he wants to know, how is it that God is allowing for all of this to take place, for the righteous to then have what their justice is come out perverted. And so the book is him asking these questions to God. And as it turns out, God ends up replying in the next few verses. And what is it that God replies with? Oh, I never even flipped that. Okay. So we're in 5:7-7. God ends up telling him, look, I've got something in the works. You're not going to believe it, but I do have a plan, and it is in action. And you can actually see the evidence of this plan if you start to take a look around. And so he says, starting in verse 5, look among the nations, observe, be astonished, wonder, because I'm doing something in your days. You would not believe if you were told. For behold, I am rising up the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous people who march throughout the earth and to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. They are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. So God tells Habakkuk, I am doing something after all. You just haven't noticed it yet. And it's kind of an interesting concept when you think about it, because as God is going through here, and we can now look back onto these verses, we can see, okay, this makes a lot of sense, that God's plan and how it is ending up playing out. And it's real easy to see what his plan is looking back into history. But as we can see in this with Habakkuk, it's really hard to see what God's plan is and the actions that he's taking in real time. And so we can see that kind of affecting what it is that's going on in Habakkuk here. But he's telling them, look, I've got something that are going on. I've brought these Chaldeans, and they're coming to judge you. That's the answer that I'm bringing for you. And so you have all of these things that are going on, and you're asking for help in reference towards it. Well, this is that answer that I've come up with. The Chaldeans are coming, and they'll be there relatively quickly. And he calls them a fierce and impetuous people. And so they're fierce, and they act quickly and move fast in how it is that they're going through in what it is in their conquest. They're dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate within themselves. So they're a self-willed people who only acknowledge their own power and their own will as their master. That is ultimately the God in which they're serving, their own conquest, and how it is that they come through. And then as God continues to explain, the people that he's raising up to deal with them, flipping through things here as I'm talking. As we see here in verses 8-11, we have the different things, or the different ways that these people then get described. It says, their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves. In the evening, their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swooping down to devour. All of them come for violence. Their horde of faces moves forward. They collect captives like sand. They mock at kings, and rulers are a laughing matter to them. They laugh at every fortress and heap up rubble to capture it. Then they will sweep through like the wind and pass on, but they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God. And so he's sending in these people, and it starts bringing up about just how intimidating and efficient these conquerors are. Because it's telling us that their horses are swifter than leopards. They're going to come in fast, and when they do, they're going to start to take over things. That they don't care for the kings that you have. They mock at the kings, and their rulers are a laughing matter to them. In verse 9, it says, they collect captives like sand. And so that's what they're doing. They're gathering people up, and something that they do is they bring these people and they would take them away. Just like we talked about with Daniel having been taken away. They take away people, and it stops them from having that nationalistic pride and trying to revolt from underneath them. And so they're taking people away from their home. And so that's what he ends up saying. This is what I've set up for you. These are the people that I'm sending to help you out with the issue that you're dealing with. And so he's sending the Chaldeans to judge Judah. And we can see his people that he's using, like I say, they're very effective in what it is that they're doing. And the question that I then want to start to ask and look into is really, should they be surprised that Judah, that is, should they be surprised in any way that this is the type of thing that would take place here? In 1 Samuel chapter 8, we can actually see what ends up being told to them as it is that they are trying to establish a king over themselves. And they receive these warnings about what it means once they have this king put over them. And so in 1 Samuel, it's telling them, nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. So, this is when Israel was trying to get a king placed over them. And they wanted to be like those other nations. And of course, this was something that they were willing to do no matter what. They didn't care. They were ready to look like the other nations. And in doing so, they received a number of warnings. And we can see in 1 Samuel chapter 12, 13 through 15, that those warnings that they get. They sound like, okay, you can have this king, but that still means that you're going to have to listen to me, being God, me first. And so in doing this setup, all you've done, instead of changing your hierarchy of command, you've actually just complicated it, because you have God on top, a king, and then the people, rather than God and the people. And so now it's this more complicated system that they've implemented, and in this extra complication means that there's going to be more people needing to fall in line for everything to work out. So again, we're reading in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verses 13 through 15. Now therefore, here is a king whom you have chosen, whom you have asked for. And behold, the Lord has set a king over you. If you will fear the Lord and serve him, and listen to his voice, and not rebel against the command of the Lord, then both you and also the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God. If you will not listen to the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the command of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you, as it was against your fathers. And so we can see that, hey, this is this complication that I'm talking about. That now what they're going to have is their king listen as well as the people listen. And once the king starts to go against what God wants and starts to rebel, it starts to cause this corruption. And we've seen this very thing taking place in Judah, where now they've gone in and have a corrupt king that is starting to go through, and the people are finding a deterioration take place at that same time. And so God tells them that the hand of the Lord will be against you as it was against your fathers. So Israel should be well aware at this point what it means when they are going against God. And so Judah as well is going to be aware of what it was that Israel had been told. When it was that they had first implemented this king, when they first got Saul over them. And so they should understand this wickedness that they're going to be judged for. So at this point, there should be nobody who is surprised by what's going to end up happening to them. So how does that mean that Habakkuk is going to respond to what he's just learned? Like I said, it makes sense that he'd be on board or understand at least what's going on, but it doesn't seem to be that way. So, how is it that he reacts? He ends up just looking at what he's being told and is pretty much baffled by the response that he gets. Yeah, Dan.
Whatever God does. He doesn't necessarily understand what's going to happen, but he's going to honor that God has the authority to do what God's going to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. When it comes to what he expresses in these next verses, in 12 through 13, at first he starts this off by talking about God being everlasting and the Holy One. And he acknowledges God and who he is and being infinite and holy, and that he's going to be making the right decision. And then continues on, Lord, you have appointed them to judge, and you, O rock, have established them to correct. And these aren't done with a question mark. This is him saying, this is what you have set up to do. And so I understand that. That's exactly right. So he starts off and he acknowledges God for what he is as his ruler, and he's saying, I've got full faith in you, but I don't understand. And this conversation continues between God and Habakkuk, and at the very end, this is a story about faith. And he's admitting that he's going to listen to what God says, and he's going to be okay with that because he understands in God's infinite, in his infinite wisdom and his holiness.
Well, initially, he's concerned about God using the Chaldeans, a very wicked and violent nation. How dare, they come in and take over Jerusalem, their holy city. I mean, he's very concerned about God's use of that particular nation. And he doesn't understand that plan.
So when it comes to it, he's looking at the Chaldeans and he's saying, these people are wicked, and how can you use them to be the judge over somebody more righteous than them? This doesn't make any sense. But then as it kind of concludes, as we'll go in, and we'll get further into this in a bit, but at the beginning of chapter 1, he ends up saying that I'm going to be sitting here waiting for you to tell me what I'm wrong about, because I obviously don't understand something. And so in this, that's exactly it. Habakkuk is got some type of issue, but he understands and believes in God to such an extent that he's willing to try and figure out what it is that he wants from him, what it is that he's supposed to do, so that way he can continue to believe and further understand God. And so in Habakkuk, we'll kind of read through now some of this. In Habakkuk chapter 12, verse 13, are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We will not die. You, O Lord, have appointed them to judge, and you, O rock, have established them to correct. Your eyes are too pure to approve evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. Why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? So again, he starts off exalting God and recognizing him as the everlasting, or as infinite, as his Holy One, and that God is the absolute holy. And so on this basis of confidence, he says that he cannot die. As far as God is not going to die, and in his holiness, he'll never do wrong. As well, he'll never deny himself or the covenant that he made with his people. And so the prophet confesses his assurance and says, we shall not die. Because he understands that covenant that was made and that God's not going against it. So he acknowledges what God has told him. And then he's also appointed these people, the Chaldeans, for the correction of Judah. He then starts to, in the very next verse, address his own issues and that confusion it is that he has and that he's now faced with and has to understand. He's kind of grappling with that concept that we're talking about, where he doesn't understand how God can use these evil people and then to correct somebody more righteous than those people are. And he continues in summarizing these people, and his summary actually in a couple of points align with the way that God summarized the Chaldeans. But he continues in the next few verses 14 through 17, to summarize the people in which he finds himself dealing with here. He says, why have you made men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things without a ruler over them. The Chaldeans bring all of them up with a hook, drag them away with their net, and gather them together in their fishing net. Therefore they rejoice and are glad before they offer a sacrifice to their net. Therefore they offer a sacrifice to their net, and burn incense to their fishing net, because through these things their catch is large, and their food is plentiful. Will they therefore empty their net and continually slay nations without sparing? So again, he's going in, he's saying, how can you have these people who are going in and treating people like fish and just gathering them up? They're conquering, they're setting up, and because that's what they've done. Yeah.
He's saying how bad Judah is. My own people are bad to our own people. But he's not comparing evil with evil. He's saying, obviously the Chaldeans are worse than us. How can this happen? His own people are evil. His own kings are evil. He's seen the Assyrians, and they know about the Assyrians. Israel is evil, right? They got taken away to captivity. He knows what happened in Nineveh. Jonah went and saved 120,000 souls by having them repent. But a couple years later, the Chaldeans or Babylonians come and destroy Nineveh. They're on their way there. But nothing has changed with the leaders of Judah. They have not gone back to God. He admits that in the beginning. But later on, he says, how can this happen? These guys are mean and nasty, and they do all these terrible things. Look in the mirror. Look what's happening right now in Judah. And God says later on, tells them later on what's going to happen.
Yeah, he's kind of got that, well, we're not as bad as them, and that's, Yeah, he's like, we serve a God. They don't serve, their God is their net. And that's kind of what he's getting into with this. Their conquest is what makes them powerful. This is what establishes them in their authority. As far as looking into, and it's just like you were saying, when you compare evil with evil, when you start to go in and put this, you start to take away from yourself, and that's exactly what he's doing from. I've forgotten now all about this evil that I've talked about, everything that I've done in that whole setup, but instead now fully focused on this other person, because this is this comparison that he starts to try and draw away from. And it does, completely takes away the people of Judah's own responsibility in that sense. But again, Habakkuk at least is a smart person who understands what it is that he has found himself facing here, and is willing to listen to what God says, because he's like, well, you obviously know more than I do with this. So as it kind of continues in, he definitely understands the need for this judgment that comes through, and ends up referring to it as the salvation. And that actually is him starting to acknowledge that this is something that does need to take place. In chapter 3, he goes into that salvation aspect that's coming from this conquest that's going to take them over. But in verses 14 through 17, we definitely see him talking about these people who are going in, starting to get he's starting to look at all of these things that they're starting to do, because they're just wiping everybody out that they're coming across and gathering them up. And so that's when he starts calling them like a net as they're going through, and the people that they're going through and collecting are like fish. And he makes this, and he talks about them sacrificing to their net. They're so engrossed in their own power and ability to make this conquest happen that's how they start to look at things. They're sacrificing to their net. And if we look into what it is that God had said about the people, and we'll start in verse 9, it says, oh, Jessica. Yeah, so this was something that was set into place well before it ever came through. And in fact, I mean, kind of with that whole concept of God setting something up and then it coming to fruition, I mean, Saul, even with that, ends up being told that you're going to end up being dethroned, and then it takes a little bit later, but David ends up kind of coming in. And so this is just this is the act that you've done. These are the consequences. It's going to happen. And now here it is at this time where we can see this all starting to come to fruition from what had been said. And so God follows through on what it is that he says as far as holding people accountable. And he's holding the people of Judah accountable for the wickedness that they've ended up demonstrating in their actions. And so we can see here, and again, kind of coming in with the representation of what Habakkuk was using here. He talks about the people being gathered up like fish in that net. And when it comes to how God is describing them, it actually says, all of them come for violence. Their horde of faces move forward. They collect captives like sand. Kind of talking about how effective they are at gathering up the people that they're dealing with here. So, I mean, in Habakkuk, he's like, how can you leave these people who are gathering people up like fish? But then God had already acknowledged this aspect about them, saying, he knew this. I mean, Habakkuk isn't coming up to him with any type of new information. This was something that he had already laid out. And so they're capturing all that they can, all these people like fish, and then they're sacrificing to their net, that they're in that self-willed aspect. And in verse 7, they're dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate within themselves. And so these people have this symbol of their own power that they have here, and this is something that they take their own authority within themselves, and this net that is being used to describe these people and the sacrifices that they're making to it, I mean, it's just this conquest. This is all that they care about. And so this is him kind of painting this picture, but again, this is nothing new to God. This is exactly what he was telling him when he described the people that were going to come. And so when it comes into this reply that he ends up having, he has all these questions that he ends up setting up of how is it that you can let all of this take place. He then asks that question, how long will God allow for them to do this? How can such a nation be used as this tool? That's how he ends out that verse in that chapter in verse 17. They therefore empty their net and continually slay nations without sparing. And so he's asking how long is this going to be able to be permitted? That they can continue this conquest and act in this way. And then he sits in chapter 2, verse 1, and he ends up telling God that I'm going to be waiting for your reply here. He says, I will stand on my guard post and station myself on the rampart, and I will keep watch to see what he will speak to me and how I may reply when I am reproved. And so Habakkuk starts the next chapter of that book saying he's waiting for God's reply so that he can he's going to be sitting by it like a watchman, sitting on a tower, waiting to see what God ends up replying back to him so that he can have this confusion that he has corrected, that he can be reproved or to be rebuked in it, so that he can then understand where it is that God's coming from, because again, as he acknowledged in verse 12, that God is everlasting. He understands God's holiness. And so he just says, I need to have this worked out. So now I'm going to be sitting here waiting for you to tell me where I'm going wrong. And that's how we end up starting into chapter 2, which we will be able to get into for next week. Chapter 2. And so, yeah, I appreciate everybody's time here with me today, kind of going through. Yeah, I was going to ask, actually, for questions and comments and then got distracted.
When Habakkuk says in the last part, he says, I have the King James, New King James, and I use the last sentence reads, and what I will answer when I am corrected. And I think what that says is that I'm waiting to find out from you what I should do differently than what I've been doing.
Yeah, exactly. That this was, and I think that's an amazing characteristic from what we see from him. Just that he understands that he doesn't have all these answers. And that's what he really is I think, a thing that can be really pulled out from this. That his faithfulness despite what he doesn't seem to understand. Any other comments? Yeah.
Home in verse 4 to me. If we just sit back and see law being destroyed and not being followed through, and judgment not being carried forth correctly, we're just sitting there letting this happen, then we should not be surprised if someone comes along and we are encompassed by wicked and evil. We are given this example. God gave us this example because the Babylonians only lasted about 100 years. The Persians came along and destroyed them and obliterated them. There's almost nothing left of Chaldea they can't even find. Then the Greeks come along and take over the Persians, and the Romans take over the Greeks. Nothing's new under the sun. But all along God says, you follow me and look out for yourselves. Do what's right, and I'll be behind you. We got to take it into effect and put it on our shoulders too.
In fact, he ends up even talking about, and this was something I was going to mention and I didn't end up doing it. Let me try and find out what verse that it's, when God ends up saying that in verse 11, then they will sweep through like the wind and pass on, but they will be held guilty, those whose strength is their God. So he's saying, that this is going to be the case, that even these people who don't believe in God, because Israel and Judah, it makes sense that they would be under God's authority since they are his people. And there's so much interaction that we can see taking place in these warnings. But he's saying, even these people who don't put any faith into me, they're under my authority as well, that they're going to be held guilty in this same way. And like we're saying, this is something that ends up taking place in 100 years, just under 100 years. Yeah, his authority, we can actually see that going in. And it is a repeated aspect in history that we can see going on. Any other comments? Carol?
Interesting to note the relationship that Habakkuk has with God here, where we see him boldly going and questioning God and letting God know, I don't understand, I need answers. And I think that's a good thing for us to remember, that when we are confused or not sure what's happening, we don't understand God's ways, that we should go to God and ask for direction, and he will give it to us. And so he's now going to wait for that response. And he knows he will receive it, and he's willing and humble enough to accept correction, because he knows he doesn't have it all together yet. Yeah. So when God answers, he knows he'll have what he needs.
Yeah, there's a sense of urgency that I need to have this correction, but he's definitely understanding too of God's own time. He's sitting on a watchtower. He is waiting for God. He's not saying, answer me this question right this instance, I need to know to move on, but he's saying, I need to know this, I'm going to sit and wait for it to come through in your time. So he's sitting like a watchtower. Yeah, that's kind of an interesting concept. I don't actually have a good answer to be coming back with that on, but yeah, definitely, there's actually some similarities in the book in reference towards that kind of concept of healing through suffering that Job ends up coming in and being able to learn through that aspect, as well as this is addressed to an entire nation, as you were saying. And so it's definitely some similarities that you can kind of draw between, but why God acted in such a way with one versus the other, like I say, yeah, I wouldn't even know how to, yeah, I know, but definitely an interesting concept. Anybody else?
I was just about to bring up Job, but I think the similarities with Job and Habakkuk is that both of them are asking questions, and running themes throughout the entire Bible with children of Israel, so other people have that concept of who the blood God is. So very, because particularly at the very end of Job, when he after he has this conversation with God, he kind of realizes, I thought I heard you from here, but now I see you. So so the way the man thinks, the way the God thinks is different. So I think that those are also some big similarities where I think, why not? Job's wondering why is this happening, and the Max saying why is this evil going on? They have to see that the mind of God is different than theirs.
All right, well, I think that it is time for us to wrap up here. So I appreciate everybody's comments. It definitely was actually very helpful for me on my aspect of trying to get used to this format. So I appreciate everybody's participation in the class.